Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. Now on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. From evening until morning, it was above the tabernacle like the appearance of fire. Can you imagine every night seeing that? So it was always. Some of you have heard the term Shekinah glory, describing God's presence in the tabernacle. The word Shekinah is a Hebrew word that is translated here as always. In other words, the permanent dwelling of God in the midst of his people, in the Holy of Holies and in the cloud of fire, pillar of fire and pillar of cloud. So always, Shekinah glory. The cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Wouldn't you like to see that transition? Kind of like a beautiful sunset. The clouds start turning fiery red. From being a cloud, they look like they're on fire. That's kind of how it happened, only in a more brilliant way. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, after that the children of Israel would journey. And in the place where the cloud settled, there the children of Israel would pitch their tents. At the command of the Lord, the children of Israel would journey. And at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud stayed above the tabernacle, they remained encamped. Even when the cloud continued long, many days above the tabernacle, the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not journey. So it was when the cloud was above the tabernacle a few days, according to the command of the Lord, they would remain encamped, and according to the command of the Lord, they would journey. So it was when the cloud remained only from evening until morning. When the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they would journey. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud was taken up, they would journey. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud remained above the tabernacle, the children of Israel would remain encamped and not journey. But when it was taken up, they would journey. At the command of the Lord, they remained encamped, and at the command of the Lord, they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Now, there's a number of reasons why this is a real interesting passage. This might be the only part of their whole journey that it seems like, according to this passage, they never rebelled at. In other words, if the cloud was not taking them forward, they didn't go forward. So we don't have any instance of them saying, I'm tired of this spot, we're just going to go on whether the cloud goes or not. Now that would fit in with the rest of their rebellion, that they did just about everything that the Lord provided. But in this case, they obeyed it. So I guess that's one good thing to be said about them on this journey. Last week we talked about the different groups, the groups of 3 tribes on each of the 4 sides, and the standard that they had, the flag, the ensign, and what those flags represented. You know, the lion with Judah and that group at the entrance, and then on the south side, the man's head with Reuben and his group, and then on the back side of the Holy of Holies on the west would be the ox with Ephraim and their group, and then on the north side with Dan and his group would be the eagle. And how that those 4 pictures on those flags were the same 4 images on the cherubim that's scattered throughout the Bible. And so you'd be looking at the cherubim, and you'd probably, if you're looking at it from one direction, you'd see the lion, but you knew that on the left side would be the man's head, on the right side would be the eagle, and on the far side would be the ox. And then we also talked about how those 4 images are 4 separate images of Christ. Certainly he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, but he's also a man. He came as a man, but on the opposite side of that is the eagle, a heavenly being. So the idea of Jesus being God and man in one is on each side of the tabernacle in those images. And of course, on the west side would be the ox, the symbol of strength. And certainly he is a powerful God. So just a lot built into that to me is just fascinating. And I'm wanting to take it a step further today. And I want to give some credit to my dear wife for bringing up a couple of weeks ago, and then credit to Sister Carly to make her feel better in her illness. My wife said that Carly mentioned a few weeks ago about the idea of the cross being embedded into the tabernacle. And I'm enlarging that a little bit to simply say the gospel. The gospel message is deeply embedded in the tabernacle. And I'm going to show that in several different ways. Another way to look at this is that a lot of doctrine, a lot of very important doctrine, is embedded in the tabernacle. The book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation talks about the heavenly tabernacle, and that the earthly tabernacle is a type of the heavenly tabernacle. So just in that comparison, you begin to understand this earthly tabernacle has many heavenly or spiritual types and shadows, symbols built into it, because it's a representation of that which is in heaven. Just that alone should tell you, I need to think more deeply about the tabernacle, the different parts of it, the message that God's trying to get across to me, the gospel message of Christ and the cross, and all of that is built into the tabernacle. The first thing, before I even get into that, is one important doctrine that's embedded in the tabernacle is the idea of the Trinity. 3 in 1. 3 in 1. There's a lot of 3 in 1s built into the tabernacle. You have certainly the holy place, the one on the right, the holy place back there, and then the Holy of Holies. And so you have within the Holy of Holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant, but really it's one, but it's really 3 parts. And this idea, this intimate idea of it's 3, but not really 3, it's 1. Because you have the Ark, but then you have the mercy seat, which is the lid, which is surely a picture of Christ. And inside the ark, you have the tables of the law. So you have the demands of God, the 10 commandments. These are God's demands on us. But then you have the mercy seat above it, showing that He's also a God of forgiveness and mercy and love. And so that's really kind of one piece of furniture, but it's in 2 parts. And then the third, of course, are the cherubim above. And if you study all through the tabernacle, you're getting this idea of God's building in this principle that He wants them to think about. Why are there 3 in 1 so often? Inside the ark was not only the 10 commandments, but you had the Aaron's rod that budded, and you had the pot of manna. And what those symbolize about God, but again, it's 3, but it's in 1. Then you come to the holy place outside the Holy of Holies, and you have 3 pieces of furniture. The altar of incense, the lampstand or candlestick, and then across from it, the table of showbread. So over and over, and we could give other examples of this in the tabernacle, the idea of 3 in 1. We've spoken through the years, you've heard me say many times, that the Passover, when they were in Egypt and they killed the Passover lamb, and they were to put blood above the door and on both sides. And we've said that's a picture of the cross in that Passover. But it's not just a picture of the cross by linking them together. It's the blood of the cross. It's the blood that makes it the cross. So we talk a lot about the cross of Christ, but the cross itself was just a piece of wood. It was the same cross that the two thieves died on. So the cross is symbolic of it's symbolic of the blood shed on it and the love that was there on it in the person of Christ. So the cross, we're not talking about the literal cross, we're talking about the event that happened on the cross that makes it so special to us. Even the tabernacle as a whole is the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the outer court. So even as a whole, it's this idea that it takes all three parts to be the one tabernacle, but it is in three compartments. So again, God is trying to instill them to think, why this 3-in-1 idea keeps repeating, and what am I supposed to learn from that? Well, they were taught the Trinity like we are taught the Trinity. And they didn't quite understand the way we do who the three persons were and what their different responsibilities are. But they had a sense. They believed in God Yahweh, which we might call God the Father. They also believed in a coming Messiah from God, from heaven. And then the Old Testament talks quite a bit about the work of the Spirit. So they knew the three different, maybe not to the degree that the New Testament opens it up, but they understood it to a degree. Now, just like that Passover door, and we don't know the dimensions of the door. You know, modern doors have kind of standard dimensions of height and width. But it may well have been like the tabernacle was, twice as high as it was wide. Very possibly. They were shorter people back then. They didn't have to have the 8-foot high doors or 7-foot high doors or even 6-foot high doors probably. So it very well may have been 2-to-1, just like the tabernacle. And so the Passover door carries this idea of a 2-to-1 height to width, which would mean that the blood would be on top, and then probably the blood on the sides would be probably not below shoulder high. And the reason I say that is because this idea of the cross is maybe 1/3 above the cross arms and 2/3 below the cross arms. And that's one thing I'm going to try to show in some things we're going to look at this morning. Let me see if I can get this right. Gary told me how to do it. There you go. So then there's how the tribes are camped around the tabernacle. And this little pencil drawing I made really makes this stand out, where and this has the population, but it doesn't include the population of the Levites scattered around. So the drawing I did will include that as a total amount of people. But the amount of people in Judah in the east at the door, this drawing's a little bit difficult because it doesn't have the tribe numbers exactly where I do in mine. But the camp of Judah should be there where the east part is. And then the west part, the camp of Ephraim, has about a little over 100,000. If you add the Levites, Judah has about 200,000. So think of it this way with me. The total north to south, east to west, up and down, is about 300,000 total, of which Judah and the priest and Aaron and Moses and all them on that part are about 2/3 of it. You understand what I'm saying? Is about 2/3 of the whole, and then the camp of Ephraim is about 1/3 of the whole. God chose which tribes would go on which side. He chose which groups would be together. And I'm convinced in researching it further that he did that for a particular purpose, so that it would be a picture of the cross by their encampment. And so the way it has the camp of Reuben and the camp of Dan is kind of the cross arms of the cross, because they're just about even in number. So you draw the line of the tabernacle straight down the middle, because both sides are about even. So right down the middle from top to bottom. But where would you draw the cross arms? Well, by the population, you draw it about a third of the way down. Because the population of those tribes on that side, the west, are about half as much as Judah and the group on the bottom. So 2/3 to 1/3 of the total. Where would that be then? Well, the holy place is about 45 feet, isn't it? Top to bottom. If we divided the length of the tabernacle, which is 150 feet, into thirds, 50, 50, and 50. So the top third would be 50 feet down from the wall. But the holy place as a whole is only 45 feet. But you notice what they do, and I think it's probably correct. We tend to put the Holy of Holies, or the holy place with the coverings over the top, right up against the back fence. But it probably wasn't. And like both of these pictures show, there's probably a walking area behind that, so they could set it up and take it down, whether the walls were up or not. And so if that was about 5 feet, then you add about 5 feet to the 45 feet from the wall to the entrance of the holy place, and you have 1/3, 50 feet. And then 200 or 100 feet from there down to the gate. So that would mean that the cross arms of the cross would be 50 feet down, 1/3 of the way, which is exactly at the entrance into the holy place. The two sections of the holy place, which would mean the head of Christ on the cross would be within the holy place. I think that's kind of neat to think about. And then we could do the same thing with just the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Because the Holy of Holies is 15 feet, which would mean the holy place where the showbread, lampstand, and altar of incense are would then only be 30 feet, because it's 45 feet total. Again, that's 1/3 and 2/3. So then if you remove the outer court idea and put the cross only within the holy place, the cross arms would be where the veil is into the Holy of Holies. And the head of Christ would be inside the Holy of Holies. You might think making more, I think if you just kind of think about the idea of what God's trying to embed into the tabernacle as a representation of heavenly things, it all starts making sense, doesn't it? That he's painting a gospel picture of the Trinity and of the cross and of Christ within the framework. And that's besides talking about the different furnishings, like the bread of life, the light of the world, our prayers going into the Holy of Holies through the altar of incense, which is, Revelation says, is the prayer of the saints. And our prayers go through Christ into the Holy of Holies. The altar of sacrifice outside, and the laver, and the sacrifices, and the blood being shed. All of those, each of them, are in some way a picture of Christ and the blood and the cross. He's giving us an entire gospel message within the framework of a building. because he's brought heaven down to earth, the tabernacle in heaven down to earth. And he's brought heavenly things down to earth. And when Jesus was born and lived in his ministry, he brought heaven down to earth and showed people what God was like. And God is embedding that or instilling that into the tabernacle. As I said, God purposely chose which tribes would go on which side. And it's so interesting that on the north and the south, the two sides, they're just about equal in population, but not so on the east and west. It's 1/3, 2/3, because the part of the cross below the cross arms will probably be about twice as long as the part above. Then let me say this with the idea of the tribes being on each side and the tabernacle being in the middle. So they surround the tabernacle. The Passover door with the blood delivering them from death, to me, is a picture of the blood of Christ to the individual. I know it was a family that killed it, but the idea of God is sparing the firstborn in that house. So he's rescuing an individual within that house. The rest of the people would not have died if they hadn't put the blood up. The death was only to one person in that household. So the Passover blood is more about the individual. Whereas the cross pictured in the tabernacle is about the blood of Christ for the corporate, for the group, for Israel, for the church today. Because the blood of Christ was shed for both, for my personal salvation, and clearly the Bible teaches his blood was shed for his church. You put the Passover door, shaped very much like the tabernacle, and the tabernacle together, and you have the blood of Christ for individuals and for his bride, shown in both of these. Jesus died for both. Now I want to take all this and have you go over to Numbers chapter 22. And I suppose maybe part of it's just reading it out loud. Maybe part of it's getting feedback from my wife, and we discussed it a little bit as we read it. But I had never enjoyed the story of Balaam and Balak as much as I did this time. In fact, many times through the years, I thought, that's a whole lot of chapters to cover a story that is not all that thrilling to me, going to be honest. But this time it really became fascinating to me. And if you just study the different oracles, the different pronouncements, prophecies that God gave to Balaam to then pronounce publicly, you've got quite a message. A lot of prophecy, a lot of important things. Numbers 22. And of course, we laugh about the story of Balaam, the donkey talking to Balaam, and Balaam not even being surprised by it, started talking right back to the donkey, and the donkey, them having a conversation. That's pretty weird, isn't it? He didn't seem to be surprised that the donkey started talking to him. But I preached a message a while back looking at passages in the Old Testament about Christ in the Old Testament. And I said I concluded that the name of Christ in the Old Testament is called the angel of the Lord, that's Christ. And there's a number of ways to prove it. There's passages that talk about the angel of the Lord said this, and the very next statement it says, the Lord said this. And he's talking as if he's God. It's pretty clear to me. So this angel of the Lord, which we would say is Christ in verse 22, Christ stood in the way. And the donkey recognized Christ better than Balaam did, which is kind of interesting in itself. We've talked about God built into animals their ability to sense things more than we realize, I think. And this dumb donkey, we would call it, I think recognized exactly who that was. It was its creator standing in front of him. And this angel of the Lord kept getting in the way. And I really like verse 24. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall, crushed Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. Maybe it was in your salvation. Maybe it's been times since then. There's something about the mercy and kindness and love of Christ that he hems us in, pushes us into a corner. There's no way out. We have to deal with him. And I'm glad he does that at different times. Because we're rebels at heart, and we try to get around him, and we try to get past him, and we try to go do our own thing instead of being forced to not move and be confronted by him and have to deal with him. I really like this idea of Christ hemming him in so that there was no escape, and he had to deal with this one. And forcing us to admit who he is. And he says in verse 41, so it was the next day that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal, that from there he might observe the extent of his people. Upon a high, looking down over, the people camped around the tabernacle. What did he see? He saw a cross. Wouldn't he? He'd see a cross. 23, chapter 23, Balaam said to Balak, build 7 altars for me here, prepare for me here 7 bulls and 7 rams. And Balak did just as Balaam had spoken, and Balak and Balaam offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to Balak, stand by your burnt offering, and I will go. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet me, and whatever he shows me, I will tell you. So he went to a desolate height. Now, if you'll let yourself have this mindset, look for Christ everywhere, look for the cross everywhere, look for the gospel everywhere. And we believe in interpreting the Bible primarily literally. But we recognize that there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of spiritual ideas in the literal story. And in this case, I think we're leading to something that might be Balaam's spiritual conversion. First he saw the cross. Then he goes up to a desolate height. There's something about desolation. You know, that's how we saw ourselves before we were saved. We were on a desolate place, looking at the cross. Chapter 24. Now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to seek to use sorcery. So there's a change taking place in his thinking, maybe even in his heart, now that he had seen the cross. But he set his face toward the wilderness. And Balaam raised his eyes and saw Israel encamped according to their tribes, which would be in the form of a cross. And as soon as he saw that, the Spirit of God came upon him. Isn't that what happened to you when you saw the cross? The Spirit of God came upon you. And what appears to be a possible spiritual conversion here as a result, then he took up his oracle and said, the utterance of Balaam, the son of Beor, the utterance of the man whose eyes are opened. When he saw the cross, the Spirit of God came upon him and his eyes were opened. The utterance of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. He says it again before his fourth prophecy, down in verse 15. He took up an oracle and said, the utterance of Balaam and son of Beor, the utterance of the man whose eyes are opened, the utterance of him who hears the words of God and has knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. It kind of describes my salvation experience after I saw the cross. And Gary read it in class this morning, but he emphasized a different part of this prophecy. But 24:17 is one of the truly great prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament. Partly about David, but mostly about Christ. I see him. I see him. After I saw the cross, after the Spirit of God came upon me, after my eyes were wide opened, I see him. But not now. In other words, it's in the future, but I can see him now because he saw the cross. He saw the power of God. He saw the people of God. He saw the tabernacle. He probably saw the cloud by day and by night. It wouldn't have been hidden from him. And these are a period of days taking place through all this. And Balaam's seen all this activity of God down there on those people. And it stirs his heart and his mind. And God reveals this to him, a picture of Christ. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. It's there, but it's not there. A star shall come out of Jacob. That's what the wise men followed, isn't it? A scepter, that's the tool of the king. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab and destroy all the sons of tumult. And the final son of tumult is the Antichrist. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also, his enemy, shall be a possession. While Israel does valiantly, out of Jacob one shall have dominion. David, and then the greater David. And destroy the remains of the city. These are things, when I look at them, looking for Christ, looking for the gospel, I think as maybe what Jesus did after his resurrection. He said in Luke 24:44, he said to them, these are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, which Numbers is the part of the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. And we just looked at some things concerning Christ. And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures. And you cannot properly comprehend the Scriptures unless he opens your understanding. Back in verse 27, the two on the road to Emmaus, and beginning at Moses, which Numbers is one of the books of Moses, and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. We find out in our daily readings that in one of the later battles, Balaam was killed. We don't know really much more about him other than his own confession and profession. We won't know until the judgment day what his standing was before the Lord. But at least he was faithful, telling Balak, I don't want any of your money. I'm not a prophet for hire. And I can only speak what the Lord tells me to speak. And the Lord gave Balaam important things to speak. And in that process, at least Balaam himself says, my eyes have been opened. We read he didn't want to practice sorcery or any kind of divination or any kind of black arts or any of that kind of stuff that's deceptive. It seemed like he was kind of throwing that away and accepting the God of heaven into his life. At least I would like to think so. And it's all predicated, or it all happened as a result of him standing up on that desolate height, looking at that form of a cross and seeing God working among his people, that I think convicted him, and the Spirit of God came on him. And I'd like to think he had a true conversion experience. When you really see the cross, and you really see what happened on that cross, only then can you have a true change of heart and forgiveness of sins and receive him into your heart as Savior. I hope that through this message you can see the cross, you can see the one who died on it, what he did for you. We're going to have a verse of invitation song. I want you to notice one thing, that as you look at different diagrams of the tabernacle, the one thing we're not really told, and so you'll see it in different ways. We know the first thing you come to when you come in is the altar of burnt offering, and then behind that is the laver before you go into the holy place. But it doesn't say if they're on the left side or right side or the middle. And so these two drawings even disagree with each other. The big one has both of them kind of on the right side. This one has them both in the middle, one behind the other. And so in that case, I guess the sacrifices would be done on both sides. But I've always pictured the altar where the words, the outer court. That's how I've always pictured it, and then the laver kind of behind it. But I guess it's just whatever you think at the time. But kind of interesting how it's not spelled out.